They tell you to start with a blueprint, a solid plan for the life you want to build. Find the right partner, lay a strong foundation of marriage, build the walls of a home, and fill it with picture-perfect moments. I had that blueprint. I followed it to the letter. I was the architect of what I thought was a masterpiece. But what happens when you're standing in the beautiful house you built, and you realize the foundation is nothing but sand? What happens when you discover that the person you built it all with had a different set of plans all along? My story isn't about a house that fell. It's about the terrifying, messy, and ultimately glorious demolition that was required to find the only piece of ground that was ever truly mine. It's about what I had to tear down to finally build a life. My story begins at the very top, on the sun-drenched peak of a life that looked perfect from every single angle. We were the couple people pointed to, the ones who had it all figured out. A beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood, 2 cars in the driveway, a golden retriever who greeted us at the door. We had the easy rhythm of a decade together, the shared jokes, the shorthand language that only 2 people who have built a world together can speak. I was the wife, the partner, the other, better half of an unbreakable us. My identity wasn't just linked to his, it was fused. For years, I couldn't have told you where I ended and he began, and I believed that was the very definition of love. Our marriage was my fortress, the strong walls that protected me from the unpredictable winds of the world. It was the American dream, printed in glossy ink, and I was living it. But a fortress can also be a prison, and the most secure prisons are the ones you don't realize you're in. These walls weren't made of stone. They were built from the silent, immense pressure to succeed, to maintain the image, to be the stable, happy couple. They were mortared with the deeply ingrained belief, spoon-fed to me since I was a little girl, that a woman's ultimate worth is measured by the stability of her home. I was raised on the sacred doctrine that marriage is a one-time deal. It's forever. And divorce? Divorce was a scarlet letter. A bright, burning brand of personal failure that you wear for the rest of your life. A public announcement that you weren't good enough, or strong enough, or forgiving enough to make it work. Inside that gilded cage, the air had grown thin. The shine of our life was a veneer over a deep and growing disconnection. The routine that once felt like comfort now felt like a script we were both tired of performing. We'd talk about our day, about the bills, about plans for the weekend, but we weren't really talking, we were exchanging data. The silence in the car on the way to dinner parties grew longer than the conversations we'd have when we got there. Our smiling family photos, the ones that filled frames on the mantle and got dozens of likes online, they hid a loneliness so profound it ached in my bones. It's a special kind of empty, the loneliness you can only feel when you are lying next to the one person in the world you're supposed to feel most connected to. The end didn't come with a bang. There was no dramatic, movie scene confrontation with slammed doors and shattered vases. The fortress wasn't stormed. It was eroded from the inside by a quiet, steady drip of poison. The turning point was a moment so small, so mundane, it almost passed me by. It was a Tuesday night. He was on the couch, scrolling through his phone, and I was walking by with laundry. I glanced over his shoulder, not snooping, just glancing. And I saw it. A name I didn't recognize. A message with a heart emoji that wasn't for me. It was a split second, a flicker on a screen. But in that instant, the entire structure of my world groaned on its foundation. It wasn't just the text. It was the way it suddenly connected all the other dots that my mind had been refusing to connect. The flimsy excuses for being late from work. The sudden need for privacy with his phone. The way he'd started looking at me, or rather, through me. It was that cold, sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach when 1,000 tiny whispers of intuition suddenly roar into a deafening certainty. Discovering the affair wasn't just about a broken promise. It was the complete and utter demolition of my reality. It was a cosmic invalidation of the woman I thought I was, the life I thought I had, the love I thought was mine. The pain wasn't emotional, it was physical. It felt like a compound fracture of the soul, a deep, internal shattering that left me breathless. And in that moment of absolute devastation, the first battle I had to fight wasn't with him. It was with the screaming, panicked voice inside my own head. A voice that sounded a lot like my mother, like my grandmother, like society itself. And it was screaming, "Course, fix this. You have to fix this, forgive him. Be the bigger person. Save your marriage. What will people think?" That voice was the warden of my gilded cage, and for weeks, I listened to it. I tried. I really did. I tried to be the understanding wife. The forgiving wife. The wife who could absorb this blow and rebuild the fortress, stronger this time. "We had the talks," he cried. He apologized. He swore it was a mistake, that it meant nothing, that I was the only one. And I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe it so badly, that I contorted myself into knots, trying to find a version of the story where we could survive. Where Torch could survive this. But every time he touched me, my skin crawled. Every time he said, "I love you," the words landed like stones. The foundation wasn't just cracked, it was poison. And I was slowly, deliberately poisoning myself by staying. This next chapter is about courage. Not the loud, heroic, running into a burning building kind of courage. It's about the quiet, trembling, gut-wrenching courage it takes to stand in the middle of your life, with everything you've ever known and worked for, and whisper the word, enough. The days and nights that followed were an agonizing blur of indecision. It was an all-out war inside of me. On one side was the paralyzing fear of the unknown, the fear of being alone, of starting over, of the judgment, the whispers, the failure. On the other side was the bone-deep certainty that staying in this marriage, in this house, with this lie, would be a slow, quiet death of the spirit. It would be an act of self-betrayal, far greater than his. The choice to leave, when it finally came, felt like both the most selfish and the most profound act of self-preservation of my entire life. It was the moment, after a lifetime of being a we, that I chose me. Maybe for the very first time. Walking out that front door for the last time as a moment burned into my memory. I didn't just carry suitcases filled with clothes and books. I carried the invisible wreckage of a shared dream. I carried the crushing, suffocating weight of other people's judgment. I carried the ghost of the future I had so meticulously planned. The world after we was a barren, unfamiliar landscape. Everything was suddenly in black and white. The first few months were a brutal lesson in logistics and loss. There was the cold, sterile bureaucracy of lawyers' offices, where the life we built was reduced to assets and liabilities on a spreadsheet. There were the phone calls to family and friends, each one a fresh performance of my own tragedy. I saw the pitying looks from some, the ones who treated me like a fragile victim. And worse, I saw the critical whispers from others, the ones who clearly thought I should have tried harder, forgiven more, kept my home together at all costs. And then there was the silence. The deafening, soul-crushing silence of a small apartment that was mine and mine alone, a home that was no longer ours. This was the beginning of the great unbecoming. For my entire adult life, my primary identity had been his wife. It was the first thing people knew about me. Now that was gone. So, who was I? I had no idea. The identity crisis was profound. I grieved not just for the man I thought I knew, but for the future I had lost. The children we'd planned, the trips we were going to take, the old couple we were supposed to become. It was all gone. A phantom limb that ached with a pain that was both real and imagined. The task of learning how to simply quisere pedi alone was daunting. It was like learning to walk again. Every small, mundane task felt like a monumental victory. I remember the first night I managed to get through without crying myself to sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and I realized I had survived another day. I remember the first meal I cooked just for myself. Not a sad bowl of cereal, but a real meal. I set the table for one, lit a candle, and I ate, tasting the food, feeling the nourishment. It was a radical act of self-care. I remember the first time I went to a movie alone. I felt so self-conscious buying that single ticket, sitting there with an empty seat beside me. But halfway through the film, I got so lost in the story that I forgot I was alone. And I walked out of that theater, not feeling lonely, but feeling independent. This was the beginning of picking up my own broken pieces. I started to see that even shattered, they were still mine. They were sharp and messy, but they were real. And I could, piece by painful piece, start to put them together into a new mosaic, a new version of me. The final act of this story is the resurrection. It's not a dramatic, overnight transformation. It's a slow, quiet, and often messy rebuilding. From the ashes of my former self, my former life, a new woman began to take shape. This rebuilding was not a straight line to happiness. There were setbacks. There were days I would hear a song on the radio that was our song and have to pull the car over, crippled by a wave of grief. There were moments of crippling self-doubt, where that old voice would whisper, "You made a mistake. You threw it all away." There were lonely nights when I missed the simple, familiar comfort of having someone else in the house. But for the first time in my life, the foundation I was building was being laid on my own terms, on solid ground. It was being built not to impress anyone, not to fulfill a societal script, but to hold the weight of my own, authentic self. I started small. I enrolled in a pottery class, something I had wanted to do for years but had always put off. The feeling of the cool, wet clay spinning in my hands felt elemental, like I was creating something new out of formless earth. It was a metaphor I couldn't ignore. I started reaching out, not to the old couple's friends from my past life, but to new people. I forged friendships based not on shared history, but on shared values and genuine connection. These were people who only ever knew me, not as one half of a whole. I poured my energy into my career, not as a distraction, but as a passion. I took on projects that scared me. I worked late because I was driven by my own ambition, and I felt the deep, satisfying pride of building something with my own two hands. And most importantly, I learned to love the quiet hum of my own company. The silence in my apartment was no longer deafening. It was peaceful. It was the sound of freedom. It was space to think, to dream, to simply be, without the need for anyone else's validation or presence. I learned that I could be my own best company. Today, when I look in the mirror, I don't see the broken woman who failed at marriage. I don't see the scarlet letter. I see a whole woman. I see the fine lines around my eyes from laughter, and the faint scars on my soul that tell a story of resilience. My strength wasn't born from the absence of pain. It was forged in the very heart of it. It came from my ability to walk through the fire of my own life's demolition and transform that heat into power. That societal script that once held me hostage? It's now just a distant, powerless echo. I realized that divorce wasn't my failure. It was my graduation. It was me leveling up from a life that had become too small for my spirit. It was the universe's brutal but necessary way of kicking me out of a house that was about to collapse anyway. And so, my message to you, if you are walking this path, if you are standing in the rubble of what you thought your life would be, is this: the pain you feel right now, that gut-wrenching, soul-shattering pain, is the birthing of your new self. The house that fell apart didn't leave you homeless. It gave you the open, cleared space to build a home inside yourself, a home that no one can ever take from you. The terrifying decision to leave isn't an act of giving up. It's the ultimate act of faith in your own future. Today, I am not defined by the end of my marriage. I am defined by the beauty, the strength, and the unshakable authenticity of the life I built in its wake. A life that is undeniably, gloriously, and completely my own. Because I learned the greatest truth of all. The greatest freedom isn't being free from someone. It's finally being free to be yourself. And that, I can promise you, is a foundation that lasts forever. To understand how a house can collapse, you have to go back to the day the first stone was laid. You have to remember the hope, the excitement, the absolute certainty that you were building something that would last forever. Before the gilded cage, before the silence, before the fracture in my soul, there was a beginning. And it was, for all the world, perfect. It was October. The kind of sharp, brilliant autumn evening in New England that feels like a promise. A friend was having a bonfire party in their backyard. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Laughter carried on the wind, mingling with the crackle of the fire, which sent sparks dancing up into a dark star-filled sky. I was standing a little ways back from the heat, nursing a beer, feeling that comfortable, anonymous buzz of being at a party where you only know a handful of people. And then I saw him. He wasn't the loudest person there. He wasn't holding court or telling some grand story. He was leaning against an old oak tree, talking to a friend, and he laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but it was whole. It was a sound that reached across the yard and found me. And as if he felt my gaze, he looked up, and his eyes met mine through the flickering firelight. In that moment, the entire party, the music, the chatter, it all just fell away. There was only the fire and the space between us and his smile. My first impression wasn't just that he was handsome, though he was. It was a feeling of recognition, as if I'd been waiting for this exact face without even knowing it. He had a quiet confidence, an ease in his own skin that was magnetic. When he walked over to me a few minutes later, it didn't feel like a pickup line. It felt like an appointment we were both meant to keep. He asked my name, and when I told him, he repeated it softly, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. He didn't talk about the weather or the party. He asked me what I was passionate about. He asked me what my biggest, most ridiculous dream was. And he listened. Really listened. Not just waiting for his turn to talk, but with an intensity that made me feel like I was the most fascinating person he had ever met. In that first conversation, I saw the man I would fall in love with. He was ambitious, talking about the business he wanted to build, the life he envisioned, but his ambition wasn't sharp or selfish. It was creative and full of purpose. He spoke with a clarity that made me believe he could do anything he set his mind to. He was kind, stopping mid-sentence to help a friend carry more wood to the fire. He was funny, with a dry wit that caught me off guard and made me laugh from my gut. He was, in a word, solid. He felt like bedrock. In a world that felt so chaotic and uncertain, he seemed to have his feet planted firmly on the ground. He was a man with a blueprint, and from that very first night he made it clear he wanted me to be in it. Our beginning wasn't a slow burn, it was a wildfire. Everything felt easy, inevitable. The dates, the late-night talks, meeting his family. It was all seamless. There was one day, a few months in, that I will never forget. It was a miserable, rainy Sunday. We were in my tiny, first-ever apartment, trying to assemble a cheap, ridiculously complicated bookshelf. The instructions were useless, we had the wrong screwdriver, and every piece seemed to be backwards. We were both getting frustrated, on the verge of giving up. Then he started laughing, that same whole, honest laugh from the party. He pulled me down onto the floor with him, amidst the scattered screws and particle board. We just lay there, on the rug, laughing until tears streamed down our faces at the sheer absurdity of it all. The rain was drumming against the window pane, and the room was filled with the smell of wet earth and cheap coffee. When our laughter finally subsided, we were quiet for a long moment. He reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear, his touch so gentle. He looked at me, his eyes serious now, and he said, "I don't care if we ever get this bookshelf built, as long as I get to build everything else with you." That was it. That was the moment. It wasn't a diamond ring or a grand declaration in public. It was a quiet promise on a rainy Sunday, on the floor of a tiny apartment, surrounded by a mess we had made together. It was the promise of a future. A shared life. A partnership. In that moment, he wasn't just the man I was falling in love with. He was my home. And I believed, with every fiber of my being, that we were laying the foundation for a fortress that nothing in this world could ever tear down. I had no idea that the blueprint he was holding was not the same one he had shown to me. From that rainy Sunday on, the word if disappeared from our vocabulary. It was replaced by when we get married, when we buy a house, when we have kids. The question had been answered. The deal had been sealed. Not with a question, but with a quiet, mutual understanding. The proposal, when it came 6 months later, felt less like a surprise and more like a beautiful, necessary formality. He took me back to that same friend's house, to the backyard with the old oak tree. It was spring now, and the air was soft and smelled of damp earth and blooming dogwood. There was no bonfire this time, no crowd of people. There was just a blanket spread on the grass and a thermos of wine. He'd strung fairy lights in the branches of the oak tree, and as dusk settled, they began to glow, like a private constellation just for us. He didn't get down on one knee. It wasn't his style. He just took both of my hands in his grip warm and sure. He looked at me, and his eyes held that same intensity I saw on the first night, the one that made me feel like the only person in the world. He said, "I've been carrying this around for a month, waiting for the perfect moment. And I realized there is no perfect moment. There are just moments. And all I want is to have all of my moments, the perfect ones and the messy ones, with you. This is the next part of the blueprint. Will you build it with me?" He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. It wasn't about the ring. It was about the words. Pinner's the blueprint. It was the promise of a life built with intention, with purpose, with him. And my yes was the easiest word I had ever spoken. Our first few years of marriage were a golden blur of construction. We were architects in the truest sense. We bought a small starter home with a crooked porch and a backyard full of weeds. We spent our weekends covered in paint and sawdust, laughing as we tore down outdated wallpaper and put up our own. Every nail we hammered, every wall we painted, felt like a physical manifestation of our commitment. We were literally building our fortress, board by board. Our dreams were simple, classic, etched from the pages of a storybook. 2 kids, maybe 3, a dog, definitely, a house with a bigger yard and a white picket fence. We'd sit on our newly built deck at night, the smell of fresh-cut grass in the air, and we'd map it all out. He'd talk about growing his business, about providing for us, about creating a legacy. I'd talk about the garden I wanted to plant, the family traditions I wanted to start, the home I wanted to create. Our goals were perfectly aligned. 2 sets of plans that had merged into one master blueprint. And we were executing it flawlessly. There were so many moments of pure, unadulterated happiness. Our first Christmas in the new house, with a lopsided tree that was too big for the living room. The Sunday mornings spent in bed with the newspaper and coffee, our legs tangled together, the silence comfortable and complete. The parties we'd host, our home filled with friends and laughter, where we'd catch each other's eye from across the room in a silent acknowledgement. Look at this. We did this. This is ours. But if I had to choose one moment, one single, perfect frame that captured the absolute peak of our love, it would be from a trip we took for our 3rd anniversary. We drove up the coast of California, a winding, sun-drenched road trip with no real destination. One afternoon, we found a deserted stretch of beach just south of Big Sur. The cliffs were dramatic and jagged, and the Pacific was a wild, churning turquoise. We were the only 2 people for miles. We kicked off our shoes and ran into the freezing surf, screaming and laughing like children. We were breathless, our jeans soaked to the knee, the salt spray on our lips. We collapsed onto the sand, and he pulled me back against his chest, wrapping his arms around me to shield me from the wind. We just sat there for what felt like hours, watching the waves crash and recede, the rhythm of the ocean like the world's own heartbeat. The sun began to set, painting the sky in impossible shades of orange and pink and purple. It was a beauty so vast and overwhelming it made you feel small, and yet, in his arms, I had never felt safer or more significant. He was quiet for a long time, his chin resting on the top of my head. Then he whispered, so softly I could barely hear him over the waves. "This is it. Right here. If I could freeze time, this would be the moment." He tightened his embrace, and I leaned my head back into the curve of his shoulder, closing my eyes. I could feel the steady thrum of his heart against my back. In that moment, there was no past, no future. There was only the warmth of his body, the sound of the ocean, the weight of his love surrounding me like a shield. It was perfect. Utterly, unbreakably perfect. I was standing on the highest peak of the fortress we had built, looking out at a limitless horizon, absolutely convinced that nothing could ever touch us. Nothing could ever bring us down. They say that a hairline crack in a foundation can go unnoticed for years. From the outside, the house looks perfect, strong, unshakable. But deep within, a slow, silent process of separation has begun. The shift is imperceptible at first. A settling. A groan in the night that you dismiss as the house just being a house. You don't realize that the very ground beneath you is moving, until the day a fissure snakes its way up the wall where you hang your family photos. The peak of Big Sur wasn't a peak, it was the precipice. The slow descent began so subtly, I didn't even feel the change in elevation. It started not with a fight, but with a shift in the quality of the silence between us. We had always had a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between 2 people who know each other's thoughts, but this was different. This was an empty silence. It was the silence of 2 people in the same car, staring out opposite windows, each lost in a world the other was no longer invited into. The blueprint we had designed together had one major new addition: his business. It had taken off, exploding in a way that was faster and bigger than either of us had imagined. At first, I was his biggest cheerleader. His success was our success. The long hours, the missed dinners, the weekend trips, they were all deposits into the bank of our future. "It's for us," he would say, kissing my forehead as he left before sunrise. "Everything I'm building is for you, for this family we're going to have." He was still speaking the language of the blueprint, and I held on to those words like a prayer. But the business grew into a third person in our marriage. It was a demanding, insatiable entity that took all his best energy, his creativity, his passion. I got what was left over. I got the exhausted sighs at the end of the day, the distracted nods while he scrolled through emails during dinner. The man who used to ask me about my biggest, most ridiculous dreams now barely asked how my day was. Our conversations became logistical. Who was paying the electric bill? Did I remember to pick up the dry cleaning? We were no longer partners in a life. We were co-managers of a household. The first fissure appeared on a Tuesday. I had spent the entire day cooking his favorite meal, a complicated beef bourguignon that filled the house with a rich, warm aroma. It was my way of trying to reclaim a small piece of our old life, to create a moment that was just about us. He was supposed to be home at 7. At 7:30 I texted, *, everything's ready. Getting hungry smiley face. No reply. At 8, I called. It went to voicemail. At 9:15, he walked through the door, not looking apologetic, but annoyed, as if my expectation that he be home on time was an unfair burden. He tossed his keys on the counter. "Sorry, long day, I already ate with a client." He didn't even seem to notice the carefully set table, or the smell of the food I'd spent hours on. I just stood there, my heart sinking into my stomach. I pointed to the pot on the stove, and I heard my own voice, small and tight. I cooked." He glanced over, a flicker of something, maybe guilt, maybe just irritation, in his eyes. "Babe, it looks great, but you should have known I'd be late. You know how crazy things are right now. Just save it for tomorrow." And that was it. He didn't see the gesture, he didn't see the effort, he saw an inconvenience. He saw a logistical error. And in his justification, he made it my fault. "You should have known." I felt a cold wave of confusion wash over me. Was he right? Was I being unreasonable? I was supposed to be the supportive wife. The doctrine I was raised on whispered that a good wife adapts. A good wife understands. So I packed the meal into containers, my hands trembling slightly, and I told myself he was right. I told myself I needed to be more understanding. But as I stood there in the kitchen, in the deafening silence of our perfect house, I felt a loneliness so profound, it felt like a physical illness. The fortress had begun to feel very, very cold. That night was the beginning of a new chapter, one where his justifications became my reality. The emotional distance was now punctuated by small, sharp cuts of criticism. The way I organized the pantry was inefficient. The friends I wanted to have over were a distraction. My desire to take a vacation was unrealistic, given his workload. Each comment was a subtle recalibration of my worth, chipping away at my confidence. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't calling me names. It was far more insidious than that. It was manipulation disguised as logic. It was control disguised as concern. He would deliver these little cuts with a calm, reasonable tone that made me question my own reactions. If I got upset, I was being too emotional. If I cried, I was being dramatic. He was the architect, and I was slowly being edited out of the plans. The most painful part was the confusion. Was this what marriage was? Was this just a rough patch that strong couples worked through? The man I loved, the man who had laughed with me on a rainy floor, was still there, in flashes. He'd have a good day and be charming and loving, and it would give me a dizzying rush of hope. It was like a drug. That hope kept me trying, kept me believing that the man on the beach at Big Sur was the real him, and this cold, critical stranger was just a temporary side effect of stress and success. The final, fatal crack in the foundation came not from an earthquake, but from the quiet glow of a phone screen. It was that Tuesday night. The night that now divides my life into a before and an after. He was on the couch, in the same spot he always sat, bathed in the blue light of his phone. I was walking past with a basket of folded laundry, a mundane, domestic act in the final moments of my old life. My eyes flickered to his screen. It wasn't a conscious decision to look, it was a reflex. And there it was, a text thread, a woman's name I didn't know. And his last message to her, sent just moments before, asterisk, can't stop thinking about you. Today was incredible. And next to it, a red heart. Time didn't freeze. It shattered. The air in my lungs turned to glass. The sound of the television, the hum of the refrigerator, my own heartbeat, it all roared into a single, deafening wave of noise. It wasn't just a text message, it was a key that unlocked 100 other locked doors in my mind all at once. The late nights, the client dinners, the sudden, fierce privacy with his phone, which he now took with him even into the bathroom. The way he'd been looking straight through me for months. It was every lie, every excuse, every moment of coldness, all coalescing into one single searing truth. My body moved before my brain did. I set the laundry basket down on the floor with a soft thud. I walked around the couch and stood in front of him. He looked up from his phone, his face a mask of casual annoyance at being interrupted. My voice came out as a whisper. It was a sound I didn't recognize. Who is she? The blood drained from his face. I watched him cycle through a dozen expressions in a handful of seconds. First, confusion. Then, dawning horror, as he realized what I must have seen. Then, a pathetic, clumsy attempt at denial. What are you talking about? It's just a colleague from work. But his eyes, his terrified, guilty eyes, told the real story. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over me. The calm of pure shock. I just stood there, repeating the question, my voice a little louder each time. Who is she? And then the fortress, the house, the blueprint, the entire world we had built together, it all came crashing down. The confession was a torrent of pathetic, mumbled excuses. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. It had only been a few times. He loved me. Only me. He was just stressed. He was unhappy with work. The words were meaningless noise. I wasn't just hearing about an affair. I was witnessing the complete demolition of the man I thought I knew. The bedrock I had built my life on was revealing itself to be nothing more than a hollow shell. The pain was indescribable. It was a physical tearing sensation in the center of my chest, as if my soul was being ripped in two. And in that moment of absolute devastation, as the rubble of my life settled around me, the first voice I heard wasn't my own. It was the voice of the warden. The voice of generations of women who had been taught to endure, to forgive, to keep the family together at all costs. It was a scream from deep within my own conditioning. Types, fix this. You have to save this. Don't throw away a decade of your life. Be the strong one. Forgive him. That voice was the only thing holding up the last remaining wall of my prison, and I clung to it, because the alternative, the terrifying open space of a life without him, was too horrifying to comprehend. For weeks, our house was a mausoleum. We walked through it like ghosts, haunting the memory of a life that was already dead. The air was thick with things unsaid, with my forced attempts at forgiveness and his hollow, rehearsed apologies. I was following the warden's script. I suggested therapy. He agreed, but his heart wasn't in it. I tried to initiate intimacy. He would comply, but it felt like I was embracing a stranger, a hollow man. I was fighting so hard to save us, to glue the shattered pieces of our marriage back together, but my hands were bleeding from the effort, and he was just watching me do it. The final breaking moment wasn't a fight, it was a conversation. It was a Thursday night, about a month after the discovery. We were in the kitchen, the one we had renovated together, the one with the butcher block island we had chosen so carefully. We were attempting a normal night, a ceasefire in our Cold War. I asked him a question I had been too terrified to ask before. I needed to understand. My voice was quiet, steady. Did you love her? He was silent for a long moment, staring down at his hands on the counter. I expected him to deny it. I expected another speech about how it was a mistake, how it meant nothing. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked at me, not with guilt, but with a strange, chilling honesty. He said, "I don't know if it was love, but it was easy. With her, it was just easy. With us, it's become so much work." Work. The life we had built, the fortress, the decade of history, the promises we made under a canopy of fairy lights. It was all just work. In that single word, he didn't just confess to an affair. He confessed to his complete and utter withdrawal from our marriage. He wasn't the man who wanted to build everything with me anymore. He was the man looking for an easy way out. The foundation didn't just have a crack. It was gone. And I was the only one standing in the house, trying to hold up the roof by myself. In that instant, something inside me went still. The screaming voice of the warden finally went silent. The fight was over. Not because I had lost, but because I was the only one on the battlefield. I looked at him, the man on my kitchen island, and I didn't see my husband. I saw a stranger I had been living with. I felt a profound, terrifying calm wash over me. I took a breath, and I spoke the word that had been lodged in my throat for weeks. I want a divorce. It landed in the quiet kitchen like a bomb. He looked up, his eyes wide with genuine shock. I think he truly believed we would get through this, that I would eventually absorb the pain, and things would go back to normal. He started to protest, to backtrack, the panic rising in his voice. "No, wait, that's not what I meant. We can fix this. Don't throw this all away." But his words had no power anymore. He was arguing to save the house, but I was no longer in it. I had already walked out the door in my mind. "There is nothing left to fix," I said. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it was the truest thing I had said in years. The days that followed were a blur of brutal logistics. We were no longer a we with a shared problem. We were two separate entities with conflicting interests. The separation of our lives was a physical tearing. Packing my things was an act of archaeology, digging through layers of our shared past. Every object held a memory. The souvenir snow globe from our trip to Vermont, the cookbook his mother gave me for our first Christmas, the framed photo from our wedding day, where we looked so impossibly young and certain. I had to decide what was mine, what was his, and what was simply ours, a category that no longer existed. The hardest part was telling people. My parents, who saw marriage as a sacrament, were devastated. My mother's voice on the phone was a cocktail of pity and quiet disappointment. "Are you sure you've tried everything, honey?" Her question wasn't a question. It was an accusation. It implied my failure. Our friends fractured. Some rallied around me with fierce loyalty. Others offered awkward, neutral condolences, clearly uncomfortable with choosing a side. And a few, the ones from his circle, simply faded away, their silence a clear verdict of where their allegiance lay. I was a social leper, branded with the scarlet letter I had feared my whole life. The divorce itself was, on paper, amicable. There were no children, no custody battles. But it was a war of attrition on my soul. We met in a sterile, glass-walled conference room with our respective lawyers. The man I had shared a bed with for a decade sat across a polished mahogany table from me, and we communicated through our attorneys. The life we had built was reduced to a list of assets on a spreadsheet. Our home, the one we poured our sweat and dreams into, was labeled primary residence, its value calculated down to the dollar. Our love, our history, our future, it was all rendered meaningless in the cold transactional language of the law. The most difficult moment of all was the day we signed the final papers. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon. We were in the same conference room. We didn't speak. We didn't even make eye contact. The lawyer slid the stack of documents across the table to me. He pointed to a line at the bottom of the last page. "Sign here, please." I picked up the heavy black pen. My hand was trembling. This was it. The final nail. The official, legally binding end of us. As I brought the pen to the paper, my entire marriage flashed before my eyes. The bonfire. The rainy Sunday on the apartment floor. The sunset at Big Sur. 10 years of my life, culminating in this one. Sterile signature. A tear I didn't know I was holding fell onto the page, smudging the ink slightly. I took a shaky breath, pressed the tip of the pen to the line, and I signed my name. A name that was, once again, just my own. When I was done, I pushed the papers back across the table. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. And as I walked out of that conference room, out of that building, and into the rain, I didn't feel the overwhelming sadness I had expected. I felt the grief, yes, a deep, aching loss for the dream that had died. But underneath it, something else was stirring. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in a very long time. It was the terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly profound feeling of being completely and irrevocably free. The prison doors had swung open, and I was standing alone in the wreckage, with no blueprint, no map, and no idea where to go. But for the first time, the ground beneath my feet felt solid. Because it was finally my own. The first few months after the divorce were a masterclass in the paradox of solitude. I had craved to be free of that cold, silent house, and now, in my small, one-bedroom apartment, the silence was a physical presence. In the beginning, it was a predator. It stalked me in the early mornings, when I'd wake up and reach for a person who wasn't there. It ambushed me at night, when the only sound was the city humming outside my window, a reminder of a million other lives that were connected while mine felt severed. There were days I felt so untethered, so completely erased, that I'd go to the grocery store just to have the small human interaction of a cashier asking, paper or plastic? But slowly, painstakingly, my relationship with the silence began to change. I started to fill it, not with noise, but with intention. I started with therapy, a place where I could unpack the wreckage without judgment. My therapist gave me a name for the subtle, corrosive control I had experienced: gaslighting. Understanding that I wasn't too emotional or dramatic, but that my reality had been deliberately warped, was like being given oxygen after holding my breath for years. It was the beginning of trusting my own mind again. I reclaimed the parts of myself I had put on a shelf to make room for his dreams. I signed up for that pottery class. My first few creations were lopsided, clumsy bowls, but one didn't care. The feeling of taking a shapeless lump of clay and molding it into something real, something that was mine, was a miracle. I was doing with my hands what I was trying to do with my life. I started hiking on Saturday mornings, reconnecting with the friends who had stood by me, the ones who saw seams times and not just the broken half of a couple. We'd talk for hours, not about him, not about the past, but about ideas and books and our own futures. I poured myself into my work, and for the first time, my success felt entirely my own. Each small victory, each moment of peace, was a new brick I was laying in a foundation built just for me. Today my life looks nothing like the blueprint, and I thank God for that every day. I live in that same small apartment, but it's no longer silent or empty. It's filled with my lopsided pottery, with stacks of books I've read, with photos of my friends, with the scent of coffee I brew just for myself every morning. My routine isn't a script, it's a rhythm that I create. Some mornings I wake up and paint. Some nights I have friends over for wine and we laugh until we cry. Other nights I'm perfectly content to just be with myself, the silence now a warm, comfortable blanket. The woman who lives here is different. She is slower to trust, yes, but she is quicker to laugh. She is more discerning, but infinitely more compassionate. I learned that my greatest strength was not my ability to hold a marriage together, but my ability to let it go. I learned that love shouldn't feel like work. It should feel like home, but a home with all the windows open, not a fortress with the drawbridge up. And I learned that being alone is not the same as being lonely. Being alone is a space, and what you fill that space with is entirely up to you. Have I forgiven him? That's a complicated question. I don't think in terms of forgiving him for what he did. That's between him and whatever he believes in. But I have forgiven the situation. I have forgiven myself for not seeing it sooner. I have forgiven the universe for the brutal, necessary lesson. Forgiveness, for me, wasn't about absolution. It was about putting down the 100-pound weight of my own anger and resentment. I realized I was the only one still carrying it, and it was holding me back from walking forward into my own life. So I put it down. I left it in the rubble of the old house, and I walked away. As for the future, I no longer look at it as a blueprint to be executed. I see it as an open road. I'm not actively looking for love, but I'm no longer afraid of it. If it finds me, the man who walks beside me will have to love the woman I am today. With all her scars and all her strength, he will have to be a partner who wants to build something with me, not a director who hands me a script. But my happiness is not waiting on his arrival. My life is already full. It's full of purpose and friendship and peace. It's a life I built not from a perfect plan, but from the messy, beautiful, and gloriously imperfect pieces of my own becoming. If I could reach back through time, back through all the pain and the tears and the rebuilding, and stand beside that woman in her beautiful, perfect house, the night her world came crashing down, what would I say to her? I wouldn't tell her it's going to be easy. I wouldn't lie. I would take her trembling hands in mine, the ones that were about to pack up alive, and I would look her straight in the eye and say, "This is going to hurt. It is going to feel like a death, because it is. You are about to attend the funeral for the life you thought you'd have, and for the woman you thought you were, and you must let them die. You must grieve them. But I need you to listen to me. This ending you're so terrified of? It is not your failure. It is your beginning." I would tell her that all the strength she thinks she doesn't have is already inside her, buried under years of trying to be the person she was told to be. I would tell her that the scarlet letter she fears is a myth, a story told to keep women in their place, and that what feels like a brand of failure will one day feel like a badge of courage. I would whisper, "The blueprint was wrong. It was never your blueprint. And the most beautiful things in your life will be built in the spaces where the plan falls apart." And so, to you, if you are listening to this right now, if you are standing in the wreckage of your own life, surrounded by the rubble of a dream, your heart aching with a pain so deep you can't imagine ever feeling whole again, I see you. I want you to know that the gaping hole you feel in your life right now is not a void. It is a clearing. It is the wide open sacred space you have been given to finally, for the first time, build a home that is entirely your own. Not a fortress with walls to keep the world out, but a home inside yourself, with a foundation of self-worth so deep that no storm can ever shake it. The journey out of the rubble is not a race. It is a slow, sacred archaeology of the self. Be patient, be kind. Some days, your biggest victory will be just getting out of bed. Celebrate that. Some days, you will be knocked over by a wave of grief for what was lost. Let it wash over you. The salt in those tears will cleanse you. You are not falling apart. You are shedding a skin that was no longer yours to wear. The truth is, your real life doesn't begin when you find the right person. It begins the moment you decide to become the right person for yourself. It begins when you stop looking for someone to complete you and realize that you were never broken to begin with. That societal script that tells you your story is over? Tear it up. Burn the pages. Your greatest chapter is the one you are about to write, and you are the only author. You are not defined by the love you lost. You are defined by the love you are about to give to yourself. Because the greatest freedom you will ever know is not being free from someone. It's finally, gloriously, being free to be yourself. And that, I can promise you, is a foundation that lasts forever.